Like with my sister's table, I'm using pre-laminated kitchen benchtop slabs of Tasmanian oak. This time Mum wanted it 950mm wide, which called for just over 1.5 slabs wide, while trimming a few defects off one side. This time I used the table saw rather than the track saw, and this made it go a lot quicker. Again, dominoes were used to assist with the glue up, but that was purely for alignment, not for strength or anything like that. This time around I have some Rockler pipe clamps, which I bought from Carbotech. They're a little on the pricey side for pipe clamp heads, but they're a lot cheaper than sash clamps or parallel clamps in the same length, and they're actually really solid. We'll be getting a few more of these because they're super helpful. Although I didn't show the glue up, I glued up two 90-ish by 45-ish boards together to get the desired thickness for the legs. I rough trimmed them down so that I could skip playing them at the thickness a little bit easier. Then I used my crosscut sled with an additional fence that was screwed in and a stop block at 730mm so I could trim all the legs to final length. I used the same setup to cut some 145mm by 30mm stock to more manageable lengths before ripping them to form the apron and stretchers. Compared to my sister's table, this is a much more traditional design with a apron and 4 legs rather than 2 legs, a stretcher and, well, happen to shoehorn in an apron. So I need to now cut the stretchers to length, and to do so I've put the legs in the position they're going to go in, which is a 10mm reveal from the edge of the table, and then the apron will have a 10mm reveal from the edge of the legs. So measuring this comes to 759mm, so I'll cut that, then I can also measure the long stretcher and cut that. There'll also be 2 additional stretchers going between the apron underneath just to keep everything nice and secure. After measuring, I could use the crosscut sled again to trim to final length. Because the long stretchers were about 160mm long, I couldn't use the auxiliary fence for that, so I ganged the 2 of them together with clamps and cut both at the same time. The exact measurement doesn't matter so much as them being the identical length. So I'm now doing the joinery for the table for the apron, and as you'd expect, I'm going to use a Festool domino. Although any loose tenon or traditional tenon joinery would work just fine. I've marked all my pieces with a little squiggle to make sure I know which side is the outside, so that when I'm referencing the domino I always reference from this side. In each end I'm going to put 2 10mm tenons, dominoes, and for the entire process, I've done all the others except for this rail here, I've got my combination square set to 20mm. That way I can mark on all of these without having to measure out again, and I can keep it consistent. 20 from each side. So using my test block and the combination square set how it was for the rails, I drew this line and cut that with the domino. I then drew that line on all the other legs in all the positions they needed to be. For the second line down, I took my test rail, put it down like that, then I could use that line there, set my combination square and test that on the same block, and then transfer those lines to all the other legs. So I've got one leg left to go. Alright, so it's a little difficult to see these lines, so I'm just going to very slightly extend them with a Sharpie. So there's the two lines there, this is on the face side, so this is going to be cut here, but I actually need those lines on this side because when you're using the domino you need the reference lines, well, not where you're cutting it, otherwise you can't see that. So there's two there, and then on the other face there's the other domino will go there, so there's the two marks there. So I found that the easiest way for these particular cuts was to just clamp it down rather than using the tailstock on the vise. Rather than using the tail vise, it's just easier to overhang it a little bit and clamp it down with two clamps. The stretches were to attach about a third of the way down the length of the long apron pieces. Using a block going across the apron square gave me some way to reference the domino fence up against. Assembly was fairly straightforward. Type 1-3 was the choice because I had a helper, but if I was doing it alone I probably would have used epoxy, which is much slower setting. For the finish I used several coats of Minwax oil polyurethane. In Australia we don't have a lot of choices on hardware and finishes, and the Minwax stuff is probably the best polyurethane that I've found available in our stores. Alright, now it's come time to attach the tabletop to the apron. And there's a few different ways you can do this. You don't want to screw directly through the apron up into the tabletop because that way when the wood moves because of moisture, seasonal changes, those sorts of things, the table won't be able to expand or contract, it'll be really tied down. And that'll result most likely in cracking between the laminations of the tabletop or other sorts of warping or damage. So the more common approach is to use a clip system, something like this. This is tabletop fastener, or sometimes called a Z-clip because of the shape. There are figure of 8 ones. There's a few different types of ways of doing it, but they basically all involve a sort of floating attachment. So this will go into the rail into a slot, then a screw will go through this into the tabletop. And as the moisture or seasonal changes cause the table to expand or contract, this can slide left or right in the slot and no damage is done. So there's a few ways to cut those slots. Before assembly, you could use a table saw and put a groove all the way around the apron where you're going to attach these clips, and that's perfectly fine. You can do the same with a router. Post-assembly, there's probably two options that come to mind. One would be using a biscuit joiner, and that's probably one of the better approaches out there. For me, I'm going to use a domino, simply because this requires a 5mm hole for the clip to go into. It's a bit thicker than some of the other brands out there. So my biscuit joiner, or biscuit cutter, cuts a 4mm thick hole, so I'd need to do 2 cuts for every hole, which is just fiddly. I'd have to go back and forth. The domino, on the other hand, has a 5mm specific cutter, so it does the job. So any of those methods are just as good as the other. I wanted to do it after assembly because I kind of forgot about it. So I want to get everything plugged in and then I can cut these in place. So Mum's table is done. The finished product is actually pretty nice. I've grain filled the top before I put the polyurethane on, and there will be a separate video for that coming up probably 1 to 2 weeks time. I've got to finish editing. Unlike my sister's table, this is pretty much rock solid. It's not going anywhere. It comes in at about 50 kilos, so it's weighty enough. It's not really going to fall over too quickly. If there are parts that I have not elaborated on, please let me know in the comments below, and I can either do a follow-up video, or on future projects I can make sure I detail those sections a little bit more. On the bottom of the legs I've put felt pads so it's a bit easier to slide around. These won't be the chairs that go with it. They will be replaced eventually, but at the moment Mum doesn't have any chairs, so these are what we could find so she can at least sit at her new table. If you watch the video on fixing misplaced mortises, here's one of the misplaced mortises. You can see the filler there, the Timbermate filler, hasn't really popped at all. By sanding around it, it helps dye or stain the Timbermate filler, and the match is pretty bang on. So this is at quite close range. However, from actual viewing distance, camera is now at table height, and you can see that that's actually getting really hard to look at even when we zoom in. You can just make it out there. So overall, I'm quite happy with how those have turned out. Hope you've enjoyed this build. The next build for Mum will be a hall table, where I will hopefully go into more detail about how to do more traditional tenon and mortise with other tools other than the domino. But for something like this, it's a slow project because of the size, and it makes it very difficult for me to do filming and joinery and all of that when I've got a little bit of a time constraint on when I can get help to move the whole thing around and all of that. That whole table video probably won't be for a few weeks, as there are other projects in the line. Thanks for watching.